Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom, and we're here to discuss a beautiful book that marks the bicentennial of Tudor Place, a National Historic Landmark in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Joining me is the editor of the book, Tudor Place, America's Story Lives Here. Welcome, Leslie Buhler.
Thank you, Lois.
I read that Tudor Place is one of the two grand homes that was constructed in Washington, D.C. in 1816. Besides Tudor Place, the other great house being built was the White House, which had to be constructed after it was burnt down by the British in 1814. The builders of Tudor Place were Thomas Peter and his wife, Martha Custis Peter, who was Martha Washington's granddaughter. Tudor Place was designed by Dr. William Thornton, the architect of the first U.S. Capitol building. During 178 years of ownership, the Peter family amassed an impressive collection of American, European, and Asian objects dating from the 18th to 20th centuries. Leslie, we're going to share some fabulous pictures of this house, which is one that all of our viewers in Arlington, Virginia can visit. But first, tell us, how did you become involved in this book project?
Well, when we were planning the bicentennial for Tudor Place in 2016, the concept arose with the Board of Trustees that we do a book on Tudor Place because none had ever been done. And it is a historic site that is not that well known. And we felt that this would be a means of letting people know more about it and to understand the richness of its collections, its landscape, its architecture, and its archive and books.
Now, how long have you been with Tudor Place?
I was there for 15 years.
Okay, and now you are what, the executive director?
I just retired as executive director of Tudor Place.
Yes. So you really have been in a period of really knowing a lot about the house for being there for 15 years.
Yes.
And I thought one of the things I want to know is, where does it exist? What is the address? Where does it? How do you get to it?
Yeah, it's on what is considered the Heights of Georgetown. It's 1644 31st Street. It sits between Q and R Streets and 31st and 32nd Streets.
So it's a really, how many acres is it?
It's 5.5 acres. Originally it was 8.5, but now it's 5.5 acres.
But that's still a lot of land to be in Georgetown, isn't it?
A huge amount of land, a huge amount of land.
That's amazing. How many acres do the historic gardens cover, actually?
It's the 5.5 acres. The house itself is about 10,000 square feet.
Okay.
And there are other buildings that were put on over time, and as the use of the land changed from agrarian to being a city house,
right.
The landscape has remained the same, other than selling off of the upper portions.
Okay. Now, I learned that this estate remains one of America's last intact urban estates from the federal period, and that this home houses one of the largest Martha and George Washington collections on view outside of George Washington's Mount Vernon home. What time period is the federal period, and how long has this home been open to the public as a museum?
Well, the federal period generally is in the 18th century on into the early 19th century.
Okay.
But this is a house that part of it was built in 1795. So it was built and pulled together, so to speak, by George Thomas and Martha Peter. It completed in 1816, as you mentioned.
Yes. And I read that visitors today can enjoy a guided tour of the estate, and that there are so many incredible family artifacts and objects that belong to George and Martha Washington. And I'd like to look at one of those right now to describe the miniature of George Washington on page 4 of your book. I thought this was really an interesting piece.
This is a wonderful, wonderful piece. It's exquisite when you see it in person. It was painted in 1785 by an itinerant Irish painter by the name of Walter Robertson, Jr. And he painted this for George Washington. On the reverse side is pearls and woven hair. And in 1795, when Martha Custis married Thomas Peter, his step-granddaughter married Thomas Peter, he gave that to her as a wedding gift.
Oh, how nice. Now, Can you give our viewers a brief history of the establishment of Georgetown, which was originally two words, Georgetown?
Yes.
And a French visitor described the city of Washington in the early 1800s as a town of streets without any houses, and Georgetown as a town of homes without any streets.
Correct.
It must have been quite chaotic then, right?
Yes. Yes, Georgetown was quite a different place back then. Originally, it was a tobacco port for the sale of all the tobacco being grown in the region. And Robert Peter, Thomas Peter's father, was one of the first merchants to really establish a major wharf there. And it rivaled Alexandria in terms of tobacco trade,
Okay.
as well as Bladensburg. But Bladensburg silted in reasonably early. So Georgetown and Alexandria really had a rivalry up through the Civil War.
Interesting, interesting. Now, tell us about Robert Peter. He was a native of Glasgow, Scotland, and a prosperous tobacco merchant. And what was his relationship in terms of building Georgetown?
Well, Robert Peter immigrated to the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States then. And
To the colonies.
to the colonies, and moved to Bladensburg and then to Georgetown.
Okay.
And in Georgetown, he became the tobacco factor, was what they were termed, of the John Glassford and Company. And in doing so, that trading post, his wharves, became some of the most prosperous, and John Glassford was one of the most prosperous tobacco companies and the merchants in the Mid-Atlantic region. So Robert Peter was really critical at the very beginning of the establishment of Georgetown as a viable community. As Georgetown originally, of course, was part of Maryland.
Yes.
And when it became an actually entity, a town, Robert Peter was elected its first mayor.
Interesting, interesting. And now Robert Peter's son, Thomas, marries Martha Parke Custis, who was the granddaughter of Martha Washington, wife of President George Washington. And so there's the photos. Can you describe their wealth and social background? I mean, how old was Martha at that time?
She was 17 when she
17.
got married. Yes. And what I really find fascinating about Martha, she was the only granddaughter of Martha Washington to be born at Mount Vernon. She was born in the Blue Bedroom of Mount Vernon. And she, even though she lived with her mother at another plantation when her mother remarried, she spent a lot of time at Mount Vernon. And of course, Thomas Peter, Robert Peter's son, did a lot of trading tobacco trading for George Washington. And as a result, and he was very successful. Robert Peter owned substantial amounts of lands. He was one of the first people. He was one of the people to seed land to create the federal city. So he owned lands throughout Prince George's County, Montgomery, and Frederick County, and a huge number of slaves also. So Thomas Peter inherited quite a bit and was a substantial landowner and tobacco merchant himself. And so this marriage between Martha and Thomas was a very fortuitous one.
Absolutely. And it was also interesting to read that Martha was the favorite grandchild of Martha Washington, and she wasn't called Martha. What was the name they gave her? Was it Patty?
Patsy.
Patty.
Patsy. That was a typical name for Martha. Martha.
Okay. And so was she? So she was the favorite grandchild then, right?
Well, she was not actually the favorite grandchild.
Oh.
The favorite granddaughter, when Martha Washington's son, John Parke Custis, died during the Revolutionary War. He had married Eleanor Calvert, and when he died, Eleanor remained at Abington Plantation with her 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 grandson. And that Abington Plantation is now actually where National Airport is, Reagan National Airport is.
Interesting.
And she ended up, when she remarried David Stewart, who was a close friend of George Washington and a commissioner for the federal city, Martha and George Washington adopted the 2 children, George Washington Parke Custis, who built Arlington House in Arlington, and also Eleanor Parke Custis, Nellie, known as Nellie. And they ended up living at Mount Vernon. And Martha and her other sister Eliza lived with her parents, David Stewart and Eleanor Calvert, at Hope Park, but visited frequently.
I see. Well, now, how did Patty and her husband Thomas Peter begin to build Tudor Place? I mean, what were their main interests?
Well, they bought the property in 1805.
And there's a picture of the house.
And that picture, is from the 1860s. There were a few adjustments made in terms of the balustrades over what's called the hyphens. But Martha and Thomas, when they bought the property, there were two structures. There was a stable and a dwelling already on the property, as well as other outbuildings. And they, when they bought it, her aunt, Rosalie Steer Calvert of Riversdale Plantation, noted that poor Martha Peter had left a grand house in the city to live at this small house, but it had a beautiful view of the port and the river. So Martha and Thomas, when they moved in there, had designs on creating a house that would be notable and would represent the ideals of the very young republic at that time.
Oh, well, and certainly they did.
Yes.
And now, which member of the Peter family lived in Tudor House during the Civil War? Did the family have slaves in the Tudor house prior to the end of the Civil War?
No, although that we do know that people of African Americans were still working at Tudor Place during that time. Britannia Peter was there during the Civil War, was the owner, and she left. Her mother died in 1854, so she didn't really have ownership of the property for that long before the Civil War actually started. And of course, there was a lot of fomenting before that.
Right.
But she and her daughter left because Georgetown and went south.
Okay.
They were related, obviously, to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee had
So
married.
So they were for the
Southern
Confederacy.
sympathizers.
Right?
They were Southern sympathizers, as were many in Georgetown.
Right.
And what we do know is that she came back. She got passes to come back to Tudor Place because she had understood that large structures were being taken over to serve as hospitals.
Right, and the federal government was trying to take over the home to make it a hospital, right?
To make it a hospital.
But she stopped
that by coming back and with her daughter, and she opened up the house as a boarding house for Union officers, most of whom were actually doctors.
So that was a much better, much better for the house, right?
Right.
A lot less stress on the house. Right?
Yes, much less stress on the house. But she did say that nobody was allowed to talk about the war in her presence.
Oh, interesting.
She was a strong woman.
Yes, a very strong woman, and also that she became a living legacy of George and Martha Washington. What did she do after the war?
Well, she had this huge collection of objects that were owned by her great-grandparents, her grandparents at least.
And she knew that was important.
She knew that these were important, and she actually made them relics.
Okay.
Her parents, Martha and Thomas, used the objects, but she actually made them relics of George and Martha Washington. And displayed them throughout the house.
Very good. And now tell us about Armistead Peter, who was one of Britannia's grandchildren. In 1911, purchased shares of the home and moved into Tudor Place. And he resolved to restore it to its former glory. And did it go down significantly after the Civil War?
Yes, she had. When she first inherited the property after her mother's death, she sold off the upper portion of the property, of the 8.5 acres, to support her sister's children. Both her sister and her husband had died. And then after the Civil War, she sold off another small section to the north on the property. And with that, she added a kitchen and did some upgrades. She put gas lighting in the house. But the house and Victorianized the house. It became a completely different house than the one seen today. And she was, and she displayed all of her objects from George and Martha Washington. But after the war, as she aged, she began to let things go a little bit.
Sure. So it was hard to maintain everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure. Now, So let's describe Georgetown in the beginning of the 20th century. Your book has a photo of an important bridge from Washington to Arlington, Virginia, the Aqueduct Bridge. It's hard to believe that Georgetown's waterfront was used, what was used for in the beginning of the 20th century. Can you describe Georgetown in the beginning of the 20th century?
Yes. The Aqueduct Bridge, now the Key Bridge, the Aqueduct Bridge was created as a means of bringing goods down the canal, the C&O Canal, and transporting them over to Alexandria. And that caused the demise of the port of Georgetown. And Alexandria ruled at that point. And the bridge was changed then into being a bridge for horse and carriage and the automobiles that were at that time. But Georgetown really became more industrial. It was beginning to turn into a more industrial area. And by that time, there was meat rendering plant, flower plants. It was not, the waterfront was not a pleasant place to be.
Probably didn't smell that great.
No.
Well, tell us about Armistead Peter, who inherited the Tudor house in 1960. He and his wife moved to Paris, France, and collected art. I think we have a picture of them right there.
Quite debonair.
Quite debonair. So what did they do?
Well, Armistead Peter III, he was an artist. He was also a gentleman farmer and was very interested in gardening. And so as an adult, he was in World War II and became fascinated with things in Asia, the arts of Asia.
Yes.
And so he and his wife Caroline, who was also a very cosmopolitan person, they spent a lot of time in Paris at their farm in upstate New York and also at Tudor Place. And they collected and he painted, and they were very active socially. She was active in World War II in the Red Cross.
Okay.
So they were very...
they were a major family.
They did not work as such.
That's right. That's right. And so let's show some photos of this beautiful home. I like the drawing room at Tudor Place. It was dated to be a home museum, of course, as you mentioned, in 1984. But let's see some of the rooms in this historic home. Can you elaborate on this photo?
Yes, this is the parlor at Tudor Place. And this, of course, originally would have been used as a multi-service room without all of the furniture in the center, but put to the sides. And it had access to the service hallway. But over the years, it became, as changes in how people lived occurred, they used this room as a parlor, as a more casual sitting area.
Okay.
So when Armistead Peter III lived there, a bell would ring and people would come down at a certain time for cocktails before dinner. In that room.
Nice, how nice. And I think we have another picture from the house. There it is.
Now this is the drawing room. And the drawing room is, in the hierarchy of rooms, the most significant room. It's the most important room. So if you were to be entertained, as General Lafayette was on his grand tour, this is the room that he would have been received in, and
how elegant!
It's a very elegant room, and you can see by these images how that this is not a period house set in one specific point in time, but actually a house that was lived in by 6 generations of one family.
Beautiful. Now let's turn to the beautiful gardens. Can you describe the landscaping of Tudor Place?
The landscape that you see today is one that is evocative of its earliest years, but also, and respective of that, but also one that is largely the hand of Armistead Peter III, the last private owner. And what you see here is the rose garden and the box knot garden, as we say. And this was an original feature, but not in this location. It was destroyed during the Civil War. And so this box knot was installed by Armistead Peter III and his father, Armistead Peter Jr.
And visitors to the home can see these gardens easily, walk through, right? Oh, that's wonderful.
Absolutely.
And it was interesting to read that children roamed through the home. Do you have any stories of what they did? Did they have any?
There were many, many children that grew up at Tudor Place
over time. Over all the different generations,
over
right?
all the different generations. And they were able to ride horses. They were able, they had ponies there.
How fantastic.
In fact, Britannia, we have on loan to us from a family member a little wooden pail that with a note saying that Britannia went to the barn to get the milk from the cow in the evening to drink for her dinner. So how children lived at Tudor Place over the time was very different as life has changed.
Yes,
in
yes.
America.
What a beautiful place to grow up, though.
Yes.
So let's discuss architectural trends. Reproducing ancient temples and adapting them for modern use was a relatively new idea that Jefferson first employed at the Virginia Capitol in Richmond in 1785. Well, how did the Virginia State Capitol impact architecture in Washington, D.C., you think?
Well, I think that there were a lot of a lot of people looking at Roman and classical architecture as a means of exemplifying the ideals of the early American Republic.
Okay.
Jefferson was one, and he and William Thornton, the architect, along with Thomas and Martha and Peter, were in dialogue with Martha and Thomas Peter. We're also looking at those, as many people were looking at those examples of architecture in designing buildings in the new United States.
Well, it's so great they did. They're
Yes.
just so gorgeous.
Yes.
And so now what is unique about the staircases at Tudor Place? They're kind of unique, aren't they, in terms of...
The staircase is a floating staircase that goes up to the second floor of the main staircase. The other staircases go up to the wings
Okay.
of the house where there were other bedrooms but are now used as offices. But the staircases, the newel post is particularly interesting and would have probably had a statue on the top of it, which we no longer have or have no evidence of it, unfortunately.
Interesting.
I think the most significant architectural feature of the house is the saloon and the temple portico.
Yes,
And
yes.
that is really
Unique, yes.
very unique.
And what are the two most important paintings in the Tudor Place, do you believe? That,
Oh, goodness.
or, I mean, if you could pick two, or just two of your favorites.
Two of my favorites. One is the portrait that Armistead Peter III did of his wife Caroline in a green hat. There was a very famous book at the time. It's a green cloche hat.
Okay.
And there was a book at the time, I think by a man named Michael Black, called The Green Hat. And it's just a wonderful painting of her. There's also another painting by Cecilia Bow of Caroline Peter that's beautiful. I think my favorite two other paintings, there are a lot of prints that I love, but of the paintings are the ones of Charles and Hannah Thompson. Charles Thompson was the secretary of the Continental Congress and was the one that rode down to Mount Vernon to tell George Washington he'd been elected president, and his wife Hannah. And Hannah, he holds a book of Locke's, Thomas Locke, and sort of situating himself as a scholar of the time and a proponent of the new democratic government. And his wife Hannah, who looks very stern with a very hat on, but in her what was called a redingote, and it was a coat used, it was jacket used for riding. And she looks very stern, but she was in fact apparently a very jolly and happy person.
Okay. Now, what about you wrote that there were so many papers and the book collection at Tudor Place there were some important documents there.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
The archive and the book collection are phenomenal. Over 5,000 pieces.
5,000?
Over 5,000.
Wow.
We have over 15,000 objects in the collection. 5,000 pieces in the archive. And of course the most significant is the letter that George Washington wrote in 1775 after having been to Martha Washington, explaining to her that he had been selected to lead the Continental Army and that he would hoped it would be over soon. He'd put all of his affairs in order and she should be fine, and he hoped to be back at Mount Vernon within a year or two.
It was his penmanship,
His
right?
penmanship.
Oh,
Yes.
And you have that document.
And we have that letter. It's a very poignant letter. And Martha Washington burned all of her personal correspondence from George
She
Washington.
did? Ooh.
And only 3 letters exist. One was actually never delivered to Martha, but this is one of the most significant letters in their personal
Wonder why she
conversation.
burned them.
Well, she knew that his official correspondence was going to survive, but she did not want to have her personal correspondence with him survive.
Read by anybody else.
No.
That's right.
No.
And also the china and ceramics are wonderful in the home as well. Do you have any favorite pieces there?
I love a Meissen tea set that we have. It's very early. It's 18th century. And it is a beautiful, beautiful set. And I had learned something new.
It's on display.
It's on display, and I learned something there. There's a cup. It's called a trembleuse, and it is it's a cup with 2 handles, and it has a top, and it has a little holder for it, and it's for elderly women when they get older and they're a little shaky.
They have two ways to hold the cup.
I've never
right?
seen one before, so that was fun. But that's in that set, and it's a beautiful set. And we have other Colport and Minton and
So China lovers could have a field day
It's a field
going
day.
to Tudor Place, right?
Absolutely.
Well, now, where can our viewers find your book in Arlington or in the area?
Well, bookstores in the area, certainly, but you can also get it from Tudor Place, the museum shop, and the White House Historical Association. Bookstores throughout the area. Politics and Prose, I know, is carrying it.
I really have enjoyed this book discussion, and hope that we will all be able to visit the home in the near future.
I hope so, too. It's a treasure.
And thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.